Welcome to the Raja Press Podcasts. I'm Firoz Manji. On this episode, we speak with Kirk J. James, author of 94A 6325.
I like to call it the carceral genocide because we went from a prison population in New York that was 200,000 in the 70s. By the 90s, it was over 2 million. And statistics show that 1 in 3 Black men had a likelihood of incarceration.
Coming of age in the era of mass incarceration. This is part 1 of a 3-part interview with Kirk J. James. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoz Manji from the Raja Press. In 1994, 18-year-old Kirk J. James was a college freshman with no prior record. But he made the mistake of getting caught in the net of the Rockefeller drug laws. And for that, the state of New York stole his life. He was denied bail and processed through Riker's Island, where Jay died in a very real sense. In his place, the state created 94A 6325, a number branded onto a new piece of state property. The number would define the next 3,268 days of his existence. You might expect that the story to end in despair. You might expect it to end in violence. And for countless others, it does. But for Jay, something else happened inside those walls. Surrounded by systemic violence and racial tension in places like Coxsackie, known as the Cat, he found something unexpected: mentors. Elders called Pops and Ninja didn't just teach him to survive, they taught him to think. They introduced him to revolutionaries like George Jackson and Amilcar Cabral and Frantz Fanon, and in doing so, they gave him the tools to decolonize his mind. He began to see that his cage wasn't just made of steel. It was built on a historical foundation of slavery, maintained by the loophole in the 13th Amendment of the USA. When he was finally released in 2003, after 3 parole denials and a deportation order he had to fight, he didn't just walk free, he walked out with a mission. Today, Dr. Kirk J. James is a professor at NYU, and he uses his voice to advocate for one thing: abolition. Not reform, not repair, but the complete dismantlement of a system he argues is a direct descendant of chattel slavery. His life is proof that you can force a garden to grow through concrete. But his question to us is this: why should anyone have to? It's an honor to have you on the show, dear Jay. The Raja Press will be publishing your outstanding book shortly. I would also like to introduce you to our 2 co-editors, Ayo Ogunremi and Russell Lamy, who are going to discuss your life, your book, and our journey together. Welcome, Ayo. Welcome, Russell.
Thanks, Rose. Hello. Great to be here.
Thank you. And thank you for that incredible introduction.
You're welcome. Just to start off, we could get Jay, if you want, speak more about the work that you currently do, just so we can get a better picture of it.
No, thank you. And thank you again for that just incredible introduction. In terms of titles, I'm a professor at NYU Silver. A lot of my work is about abolition, but it's also about really rethinking. I don't think we can talk about a world without jails and prisons, without fundamentally like rethinking what it means to be human, our relationships to ourselves, our relationships to each other, our relationships to the planet. I run the Doctorate of Social Work program at NYU, and I also oversee a project called Evolve in Justice, where we create spaces and conversations to really massage this idea of justice and who's deserving of justice and what does it look like? What does it mean for us as a world to co-create justice?
Thank you so much for that.
Could you explain to us, Feroz already mentioned like the title of your book, 94A 6325. Can you just tell us concretely, break it down for us? What does that mean?
So 94, if you're arrested in New York State, in New York City, you're ultimately, and you're convicted, which over 90% of the people that are often entangled in these systems are ultimately convicted. You are then sent to a state processing facility, which I liken to maybe the door of no return. It's a place where you go. It's a place where, in Feroz's introduction, I really loved it because the human part of me ceased to exist. And instead, I was branded a number. And this number is what my family needed to know to visit me. This number is what they needed to know to send me letters, communication, to advocate on my behalf. And this is what happens to, again, most people who are convicted in a state facility. So my number 94 means it's the year. So 94 is the year 1994. A means that I was processed at a maximum security prison. In my case, it was Downstate Maximum Security Prison. And 6325 means that I was the 6,325th person to be processed at Downstate Correctional Facility. So put that in context. I went to Downstate about September, and there are different lines, right? So there's A and then there's B, C, Ds that, means different reception facilities. But in the reception facility I went to at that point in the year, I was the 6,325th person to be processed. And that was only September. So that tells you that there were thousands more that would come behind me.
Yeah, because that's just for people arrested in 94, as well as just in the A track. There were 6,325.
Yes, exactly. I love it. It's just like the A track, right? Then we don't know what happened on the B track, what happened on the C track. But, for the A track, people in that came through downstate, 6,325th person that actually came through downstate in 1994. So yeah, there's thousands more that came after me. There's thousands more that went on the B track, that went on the C track. So, just really put it in context too, right? This was an era in the 1990s. I like to call it the carceral genocide because we went from a prison population in New York that was 200,000 in the 70s. By the 90s, it was over 2 million. And statistics showed that 1 in 3 Black men had a likelihood of incarceration. You put that in context with, the policies that were being passed because we weren't seeing a crime rate that justified this level of incarceration. What we are actually seeing was policies and practices and ideas, beginning with, the 13th Amendment, right, which again legalized slavery through the form of incarceration. Then you had black codes, you had convict leasing systems. And then in the 90s, you saw like new forms of black codes in stop and frisk, in three strikes, in Rockefeller drug laws, all policies and laws which disproportionately targeted people of color, specifically young men of color of my generation. Again, 1 in 3 Black men had a likelihood of incarceration. One of my friends, Dwight, always says that, at 17, 18, a lot of people are preparing to go to college, but many people of my generation were preparing to do bids. Instead of asking what college we were going to, be like, what jail are you going to end up in? Instead of asking what major, it's like, how much time are you going to get? So, really, it was a generation. And again, if you listen to the music of that generation, 40 of us in the back of a bus, life is a short, you shouldn't be so rough, right? Like, this was all like music that was really speaking to what the world in many ways had turned a blind eye to.
the scale in this era of mass incarceration. It's difficult to wrap your head around, like, without having lived through that. And having described that, it'd be nice to hear a little bit more about, like, the initial events around your arrest and, like, what was it like being a kid in the 90s, a young Black man in the early 90s in NYC? Like, how did this manifest itself?
No, it's a great question. And in some ways I look back at it and I was like, I was prepared because what we were living in state violence, right? So even, growing up, we grew up in the era of the Central Park Five, who are now the exonerated five. But, they, in many ways, I think of are the poster children for mass incarceration. So imagine having these young men who were arrested and demonized and really made to feel like they were the worst people alive. I remember having a conversation with Councilman Yusef Salam, and he talked about being 14, 15, or however young he was when he got arrested and, just feeling like the entire world hated him. Imagine being 15 years old and feeling like the entire world hates you. And I think, it was such a beautiful reflection that he shared and vulnerable reflection because I felt like that's how most of us felt. The language that we saw about Black men in the media, on TV, we were labeled super predators. We were living in an age where, again, as we're seeing with ICE right now, we were experiencing what we would call the alphabet boys, which were all the militarized police that were in our neighborhoods that were like picking us up like TNT, FBI, ATF, all of these militarized police that were targeting us. So in many ways, like growing up in that era, I feel like we were very much like prepared, for incarceration. I remember even before being incarcerated, I can't tell you how many times, undercover cops would just jump out on us because we were Black and maybe there were two or three of us together. So, it definitely was an era where we were very conditioned to the threat of incarceration and especially seeing our friends go missing. I share in the story that after I got arrested, which was, it was horrific, right? I'd never been arrested before. And I remember one of the things that when I got arrested, I believed in this idea of justice. So I felt that, the judge is going to surely ask, right? Like, why is an 18-year-old who had never been locked up before, why is he here? Why is he facing life in prison under the Rockefeller drug laws? Can we talk about this? And no one did, right? Like, no one stopped. It didn't phase anybody that I was 18 years old and that I had never been arrested before. It didn't matter. They only saw, like, a Black man. They only saw someone who was disposable. They only saw someone who, by all accounts, they were told was a super predator and needed to, be taken off the streets. So, again, to answer your question, I really feel that we were all experiencing a culture of mass incarceration. It wasn't just what happened when we got arrested. It was really, and then you even go and you mentioned school too, right? So you look at the school system, and this was the era where schools were transitioning from what we called school safety to now police. And I felt so disconnected from the educational system and so many young Black men and, Black women, people of color feel so disconnected from the educational system, which again, once that disconnect happens, you're then punished. And, research tells us that like if you're kicked out or if you're pushed out of these educational settings, then your likelihood of incarceration is exponentially greater. So it really was this very perverse like system, that was operated. And I think like sometimes when we talk about, carceral systems, we only think about maybe the police, but it was the idea of who Black men were, which, I think Joe Biden's crime bill speech is really like horrific, but he tells you exactly what he thinks about us, right? He tells you that like there's no hope for them. They need to just be locked away. And I think like imagine having a public conversation where you're like, it's either them or our families, right? They're going to hit my mother. They're going to hit your mother, right? So this was the context in which Black men were coming of age. It was a very ideologically systemic, like violent era.
You're listening to the Daraja Press podcast. Daraja is the Kiswahili word for bridge. As its name suggests, Daraja Press seeks to build bridges, especially bridges of solidarity between and amongst movements, intellectuals, and those engaged in struggles for a just world. Check out our other episodes, books, and more at darajapress.com. So now let's get back to the show.
And in this context, I mean, not only were you surrounded by this, like the constant pressures, but your journey to your arrest, it wasn't as though you were already doing these things and you were taught by this massive carceral system, but rather you were pushed into doing these things. Like you were actively entrapped. So do you want to explain a little bit more like what that
Yeah,
process was like?
exactly. So I didn't even know the word entrapped, right? Like, and again, I think so many people we don't even know what this is. So for me, in my case, I had a friend who lured me into, essentially the commission of a crime, connected me, said, he had some friends that, he wanted me to serve as a connect for. And this process wasn't something that happened overnight. This was something where at 18 years old, I now have, quote unquote friends, men call in my house for months, luring me into being an accomplice for crime for them. And ultimately, after 4 or 5 months, I ultimately, like broke down and became an accomplice. And it turned out that these men were actually undercover police officers. So I remember being arrested and being like, oh my God, like, okay, I know that, my decisions were wrong here, right? But can we talk about how we got here, right? If undercover police officers are going to be calling an 18-year-old for 5 or 6 months, kind of like offering them money to kind of like ultimately commit a crime, I didn't feel that was justice. And that's when I learned the term entrapment. And that's when I began to realize how entrapment is such a big part of the system that no one speaks about. There was a particular book that I read, Elaine Barlett, Life on the Outside. And her story was that she was working in a hair salon in Harlem. And it was around the holiday times, and someone she knew would always come into the salon. And that person came in and said, like, hey, I know times are rough for you. I have a package. If you could just bring it to, I think it was Albany somewhere, be able to give you $1,000. Obviously, she knew that, probably there was something in the package that, was probably sketchy, right? But this is also a woman with kids. It's a holiday time, and someone is saying, like, hey, to bring a package somewhere, I'm going to give you money that you can able to buy your children gifts. You can support your family the holidays. She ultimately accepts and takes a package. And it would turn out that she was being set up, right? That they were all part of a undercover operation. And reading her book and, the research that was done in her book, I realized that entrapment is a big part of the carceral system and people are actually incentivized. So what happens is if someone gets arrested, what they'll say is like, hey, can you get us a few other people, find us some people that are selling drugs. And they then ultimately like create these things. So I feel that, my story is interesting in the sense that like there's not a lot of conversations around how entrapment like is again like really a tool of the carceral process.
Could you maybe explain some of the main characters in your life, like leading up to your arrest? So, like Polo plays a pretty big role in this. There's Heather, obviously your mom and your stepdad. Yeah, could you just paint us a picture of like what was your life like leading up to April
Leading up to my
'94?
arrest. So I had a lot of struggle with school. Like let me back up a little bit. So I came to the US in 1986. And as an immigrant who had grown up in Jamaica, I really struggled with school in America. So I felt, at 18 years old, I was pushed out of high school. I'd gotten a general equivalency degree, and I was at Nassau Community College studying criminal justice. And I really felt like, I was finding my stride. So this is maybe, a year up to my arrest. I'm a college freshman. I'm finishing my first semester of college and really beginning to kind of like think about like a professional future. So for me, the irony is this, that like I really never could have even imagined becoming arrested. Like, even though like I was definitely growing up in an era again where there were so many people being arrested, I really saw myself going to college, ultimately like figuring out some profession along the lines. And really coming of age too in 1993, 1994, before my arrest, I like to say that this for me was like the golden age. I'm 18, 19 years old, like music is incredible. This is the era of, like, so many Wu-Tang Clan, Nas, Biggie. So I really legitimately felt like I was a young man who was very committed to living my best life prior to my incarceration. So, again, like, transitioning ultimately into being a hookup for undercover agents wasn't, like, the plan for me, and you asked about Heather too. In November of 1993, I found out that I was gonna be having my first child. So that was also, a very uh, I wanna say it was a very exciting time in my life, but there's also a lot of uncertainty, right? There was also a lot of uncertainty of, like, how was I gonna provide for my child? And I never want to use that as an excuse, right, into ultimately my actions, but I think, again, like, this was the reality, right? Like, I was 18 years old, I had a child on the way, I just completed my first semester of college, and, my mother at the time, they were paying for me to go to college out of pocket. And, after the first semester, my mom, like, financially couldn't continue to pay for me to go to college, which, in many ways kind of opened the door for me to entertain, the person who had been pressuring and calling to learn me. His name was, supposedly Eddie. So, the circumstances at the time, I felt like opened the door for me to take his advances a little bit more seriously.
So when you are arrested in like pretrial like detention, it's Rikers Island when you're picked up in New York City. So you end up spending about like 5 months in Rikers. So what's the deal with Rikers? Like, can you tell us a little bit about Rikers and
Yeah.
your time there and what that was like for an 18-year-old kid?
Yeah, Rikers it's like hell, right? I think, like, if there's so many songs about, like, there's a reggae song, Kokoti. It's like, "Me no longer Rikers Island." There's so many songs that speak about Rikers Island, and, I often say that even though I'd not been arrested, I definitely knew what Rikers Island was, right? Like, through music, through, people that I knew that had been arrested and, would come back. And so to put this in context, Rikers Island is a place where it's mostly detainees, right? So people who are not convicted, people who are A, do not have bail, or B, are unable to make bail. So imagine, at this time, I want to really put in context, right? The prison system is over capacity. So we have like the greatest influx in incarceration rates in history, and Rikers Island is feeling that. It's overcrowded. I don't know what the exact numbers were, but say, for instance, if it's designed for 40,000 people, it was probably at 70,000 people, right? Imagine so many people that are like there, and the levels of frustration, because people often talk about like violence in Rikers Island without putting it in context, right? Like, imagine you are in a place where you're literally fighting for your life, meaning, you're fighting the carceral system to not be sent to prison for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And you're in a place with other people who are similarly fighting for their lives, and there's this collective frustration, right? Like, everyone is frustrated. I think people don't really understand how unjust these systems of justice are. So, for instance, I remember after seeing the judge after my arrest, I thought I would get bail, right? Like, why not? Whenever we watch TV and we see these things, right? Everybody gets bail, even the people that, you just killed 10 people, you got bail, right? So I'm like, "No bail." And not only no bail, you're actually sending me to Rikers Island. That was just really, I remember, just it was terror, it was a level of terror that, like, I'd never experienced before, if I'm being really honest with you, right? And I remember getting to Rikers Island, and I remember just feeling, like, the hopelessness and how that hopelessness then like really like plays out in violence because you're on Rikers Island and you don't know when your next court hearing is or your next court hearing is and for months, right? So everyone is not their best selves. So that plays into a lot of interpersonal violence. And, a lot of that violence is really part of the system, right? Because when the violence is taking place, it's usually us fighting each other, which then allows the system to perpetuate violence and us, unabet it, right? Because we're too divided. So I just remember getting to Rikers and just really sit in with a different level of violence. And again, that violence wasn't just physical violence, right? It's like being in a system where you're not able to be seen beyond your charges. You go and see the judge and the judge doesn't even look at you, right? The judge doesn't even look at you. It just all feels like an incredibly violent game, which then also feeds that violence, right? So everyone is just really so frustrated and it really plays out with each other because in many ways we don't know how to fight the system, but we know how to fight ourselves.
So yeah, in this context, there's no way that people are going to be able to like be their best selves, like be at ease, and like the light at the end of the tunnel is like your sentencing when you're on records, and for you, like your sentencing, you end up getting 7 to life at your sentencing. So although like it means the end of the uncertainty that being on records entails of not knowing what your future is, not knowing what the other side's gonna look like, what does it feel like to get life in prison at a maximum sentence? What's that like?
And yeah,
Yeah.
tell us like how did that actually come about? Like what was the decision that you had to make?
So again, like you're in this space, right? You're on Rikers and you're not seeing the judge, right? I think maybe I had 3 court hearings, 4 court hearings while I was on Rikers. And most people don't have like good legal representation. And even with a paid attorney, really honestly, you're not getting good legal representation unless you're paying somebody millions of dollars, right? And interestingly enough, like I was on Rikers Island during the time of the O.J. Simpson trial and O.J. Simpson arrest. So to see how, his representation, dream team, while we're on Rikers Island, like, fighting for our lives was really interesting. So again, you're on Rikers Island, right? Let's just put like I want to paint a picture. You're on Rikers Island, you have no bail and you are looking around you and it's a ocean of destruction, right? Like no one is getting good news. You're not hearing people come back from court and say, yeah, they're going to let me go. You're hearing people come back from court and say, I got 15 to life, I got 25 to life, I got 10 years, I got 5 to 15. So it's literally, we call that football numbers. All you're seeing all around you is football numbers. So after, 5, 6 months, we're in this situation and the attorneys do not want to argue a entrapment defense. I remember every time we would tell them, they're like, "Are you sure?" I'm like, "Yes, I'm sure," right? So you don't have attorneys, right? Because, to argue your defense really means that they would have to do their work and they don't want to do their work, and this is not a shade to attorneys, right? But like if you look at this specific era, even if you look today, most of these cases are pled out. And by the time you get to that point, right, by the time you get to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months, maybe a year of being in this condition, most people are ready to take a plea. Because again, Rikers Island is a detainment facility. It's not meant for people to stay 5 months, 6 months, 7 months. So the conditions are really deplorable. The food is really deplorable. And again, the violence is on a different level. So, you're having all of these things compounded. And then there's also like really honestly, there's a real fear of going to trial, because you don't feel like you're going to get a fair trial. If you're in the system and they're not even willing to see your humanity, I'm facing a judge 4 or 5 times. The guy doesn't even look at me. He doesn't even ask me one question to see who I am. Like, am I trusting that, going to trial is going to be better, right? So, you really get backed into a corner where you're looking around again, like everyone is like getting football numbers. And you ultimately have to figure out, like, okay, what is going to be Like, how do I get out of here with the least amount of damage? And it's crazy to think of that I was in a position, and to again, even put this in context, I remember when I got arrested, they were throwing out numbers like 45 years to life. That may sound ridiculous to someone, but some of the charges I had were again under the Rockefeller drug laws. And to put that in context, each charge under the Rockefeller drug law was the equivalent of murder. So, an A1 felony under the Rockefeller drug law for possessing 2 ounces or more of cocaine carried a minimum sentence of 15 years to life and a maximum sentence of 25 years to life, similar to murder. And I had multiple A1 felonies under the Rockefeller drug laws. So there was a real fear factor here that, that they could really put me in prison for a long time. So when our attorneys came back and said, like, hey, they're willing to give you a plea offer of 7 years to life, it actually sounded good. And I think this is what I wanted people to understand, right? Like, no one would ever take a sentence of 7 years to life at 19 years old. No one. Yet the conditions were such that we didn't feel we had a choice. We actually felt that this was probably the best choice for us to be able to get out of prison alive. And I think one of the things too with the conviction was they gave us a lot of misinformation, right? So we ultimately took a plea of 7 years to life to criminal possession of a controlled substance in the second. So our attorneys, because it's quote unquote a nonviolent crime, our attorneys told us, oh, you'd get work release in 3 years, you'd get this program in 4 years. So, like we were like, made to feel like, okay, this is, really not 7 years to life, right? This might be like 3 years at the most, right? Before we get some type of relief that would allow us to get out of prison. So there were numerous factors, right? And I try to really articulate that in a book because I think for an average person, like the Central Park Five, they all pled guilty to a crime they didn't do. And I think that's what people need to understand, that the system is so violent that it forces you. So many people will ultimately take pleas because they understand the violence of the system. And I don't know if, for people that are familiar with Khalif Browder, and I always reference Khalif Browder because I thought he was so incredible, right? To be arrested for a crime he didn't do and refuse to take even a plea to time served, and experience immense violence while incarcerated, but refuse to take the plea. Most people in this position would gladly take a plea to time served to go home, whether they did it or not, especially the violence he was experiencing. But he stood on business, and ultimately committed suicide because, like the violence and trauma he experienced was too much. And I think even that, right? Someone that actually was able to be like found not guilty and to leave the space still carried with them so much trauma, right? So imagine the people that don't. Imagine the people that actually are sentenced, that have to go upstate, leave their families further behind, leave their communities further behind. It's really such a violent system. And, like even again, like I felt like I struggled to really write that because I wanted people to understand that, no one just goes into this space and accepts a plea deal, right? Like there's so much violence you're experiencing. There's so much systemic injustice regarding, when you see a judge, what the conversations look like, how you feel, the lack of humanity, which ultimately, the writing is on the wall for you. Like, hey, no, this is like, we don't care about you. The only thing is about how much time you're going to get.
The dehumanization is such like an important part of this process because I think there's a way in which these things are normalized that like we see men of color, we see people of color get sentences like this, and we don't really like, think what that entails for an 18-year-old to essentially agree to be behind bars for the rest of their life potentially. And I think that is normalized. We don't think of how devastating that would be or how impossible that would feel, especially when you feel like it's totally unjust and like that your story, how this came about is totally unjust. So to be able to look a judge in the face and agree and take a plea must be so difficult, and especially like in this horrifically violent system that's pushing you to take this. Because this is a context where, you're 18, turning 19, and your daughter's born, like at this point, like you're in
Yeah.
Rikers and your daughter's born. So this is not a decision you took lightly. Like, and so
Yeah.
this is really moments like reflect on like how
Yeah.
violent this system is. That even at that point, even with your daughter born and wanting to be reunited with her, you're still like, that's a good deal. 7 years till
Yeah.
life.
Yeah. And, I often think about too, my mom who has three other, four sons, right? And just, my mom like not being able to sleep, knowing that I'm in this system and knowing that I'm potentially subjecting her to a life of me in this system. And again, like having a daughter that was born a month before I had to take a plea, right? I think it's just really it's such a violent system, and I really wanted to put these things in context because again, like, this was a context of me taking a plea of 7 years to life, right? Like, even I knew my story, I knew how I got there, I knew that I was entrapped. And yet no one wanted to hear that, right? No one wanted to talk about mitigating factors. No one even saw my humanity. And I think that was one of the things that, that really hurt me so much, but it really also pushed me to kind of, become the person I am today, right? Because I feel maybe the most violent thing that we can do to each other is not see our humanities. So really, like, I think so much of the work that I do today is really to attack and dismantle any system that refuses to see the fullness of people, irrespective to an action that they may have perpetuated, right? Because no one is their worst action. And if we're not willing to see people across the spectrum, we're going to create, very types of carceral systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You were listening to an interview with Kirk J. James, author of 94A 6325, Coming of Age in the Era of Mass Incarceration. It is available at the Raja Press shortly. You can pre-order it now. You can find it along with other important books on our website at therajapress.com. That was part one of our three-part interview. On the next episode of the Raja Press podcasts, part two of this interview, where Kirk gets introduced to Pops and other revolutionary thinkers. This episode was produced by Pierre Loisel, music by Arlo Maverick. I'm Firoz Manji from the Raja Press. Thank you for listening.